Stoicism appeared approximately in 300 BC in ancient Greece. The founder of this school is Xinon of Scythia, a man with a difficult soul. He used to be a merchant, but once he had a shipwreck, after which he became interested in philosophy and moved to Athens, where he became a disciple of the famous philosopher Crates, whom Xinon was introduced as a person similar to Socrates. Here it is necessary to make a small digression. Crates was a philosopher horseman, that is, a person as practical and simple as possible. Even the term horseman is translated as similar to a dog, which says enough about this philosophy. Horsemen rejected the theoretical recognition and achievement of civilization, and believed that happiness can be achieved by living according to one's nature. The most famous horseman is Diogenes, a person who does not need an introduction, because you definitely heard something about his whip. Horsemanism is quite an interesting topic, even worthy of a separate video. I just now pointed out some conceptions of horsemen, which were reinterpreted by Stoics, and you will learn about them later. Just keep it in mind. Later, Xinon became an independent philosopher, having withdrawn wisdom from Crates and other teachers, and began to introduce philosophical speeches in his own. In fact, this is where the name of Xenon's philosophy and his students came from. Xinon laid the basic ideas of Stoicism, in particular, the study of three disciplines, physics, logic, and ethics, as well as the concept of living according to one's own nature, which we will talk about later. Xenon's followers supplemented and improved the philosophy of Stoicism. In general, they highlight three stages of the development of this philosophical school: the early stage, the middle stage, and the late stage. Of all three periods, the last one is well known to us, when philosophers, through some historical events, moved from Athens to Rome, where they continued to teach and develop their ideas. From this period, we know Musonius Rufus, his students Rappo, and the past Epictetus, the orator Seneca, and also the Roman Emperor Mark Aurelius, on whom the history of Stoicism actually ends. Philosophical schools gradually fell due to the introduction of Christianity by Emperor Constantine in 312. The same fate awaited the Stoics, and the closure of the Platonic Academy in 529 by Emperor Justin can be considered the end of this ancient philosophy. However, the ideas of the Stoics continued to live in the further works of thinkers. For example, scholastics like Aurelius Augustine, Boetius, Thomas Aquinas, or philosophers like Giordano Bruno, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Spinoza, etc. In addition, Stoicism in the 20th century got a second life, putting ideas for the logotherapy of Viktor Frankl, and became the basis for the rational emotional behavioral therapy of Albert Ellis. His name is Stoicism, and as we can see, Stoicism is a rather universal philosophy, because it was lived by both Rappa and the merchant and the emperor, and even now, this philosophy experiences a new wave of interest in itself. This is an exemplary philosophy, the main purpose of which is a happy life, but it is not worth rejoicing too early. Stoicism is not a charming pill that will solve all your problems, and not even a convenient set of tools to live in peace. Stoicism is, first of all, a philosophy, that is, a worldview according to which one should live, without tearing out certain elements that are convenient for oneself, or in other words, unprofitable. So let's move on to the components, namely to the three disciplines called Xenon, which I have already mentioned earlier: physics, logic, and ethics. His follower Chrysippus used this metaphor to explain the essence of these disciplines. He compared philosophy with a garden, and ethics with its fruits. In order to maintain a rich crop, we must enrich the soil with fertilizer and grow beautiful trees. Soil and trees are physics, which gives us an understanding of the world in which we live. In addition, our garden must be protected from adverse effects, otherwise it will overgrow and the crop will disappear. The function of protection is performed by logic, which protects us from the mistakes of thinking. In summary, physics is soil and trees, logic is the protection of the garden from adverse effects, and ethics is the crop of this garden. Later, Epictetus proposed his concept about the role of these disciplines. There are three spheres in which a person must be trained to become good and noble. The first is the will to gain and the will to avoid. A person must learn not to experience failure in achieving his goal and not to fall into what he wants to avoid. The second sphere is related to impulse, to act or not to act, and in general to the sphere of foresight. We must act in an orderly manner, with proper attention and responsible caution. The third sphere is aimed at not giving in to delusions, and in general to be able to correctly assess and agree only with what is true. To sum up, Epictetus believed that in order to be a good and noble person, you need to develop in three directions. The first is the control of desires and fears. You must learn to strive only for what is really under your control, and to avoid what you can avoid so as not to experience disappointment or suffering. The second is action and inactivity. We are talking about actions, and they must be thoughtful, balanced, and responsible for what you do in a certain situation. The third is decision-making and assessment. It is important not to deceive yourself, not to make hasty conclusions, and to learn to accept what you think is right. These three aspects help a person to live sensibly, acting according to their principles and mind. In this video, we will go through the basic concepts of Stoicism, which I have divided into these three disciplines or directions. So let's start with the basics of which Stoicism is based. Of course, you can throw in your options, and from some of them, you can actually physically refuse. But this will lead to certain consequences, and most likely negative ones. Each role has its obligations, rights, and model of behavior, and it must be performed recklessly and with respect. In the context of Stoicism, the role is not an inscription on your badge, but an activity. You are an actor who accepts and takes on your position, and it may happen that this position changes. You will have a new role, or you will lose the one you have. But the main thing is not who you play, but how, and if the previous roles you played were good, then the next ones will be in your favor. So Stoicism saw the nature of a person as a social creature that has a mind, and is obliged to use it to benefit society by taking up a certain position in it. Sometimes there are other interpretations of nature. As Seneca said, that a person was born not only for action, but also from the perspective of the world. So even the world of rest in Stoicism was quite productive, in the correct understanding of this word, the concept of logos. And now let's talk about how Stoicism saw this world. Stoicism believed that the whole world is one whole, a holistic and grouped unit, all parts of which interact with each other and have similarity. In the opinion of Stoicism, the whole world consists only of a material substance, and even abstract things, such as justice or wisdom, are holistic. Stoicism recognized the reality of such things as emptiness, space, and time, but believed that they do not exist by themselves, but as a result of the existence of material bodies. In the opinion of Stoicism, the whole world is subject to the actions of two principles, active and passive. The active beginning acts on the basis of the passive principle to build the world and everything in it. As a result, the passive beginning makes up the world. Stoicism calls the passive beginning by two names, matter and substance. Principles are constant, they do not arise and do not disappear. The rational and active principle is described by Stoics as a logos, or a God who is eternal and permeates all matter, is the master of all things. He is a universal reason. Stoics also use these terms in two other meanings. For the meaning of what something is made of. For example, a piece of bronze is the matter of a statue. And for the meaning of the primary matter, a formless eternal body with constant mass and variable density. All these bodies behind the Stoics are not just things to which you can touch, but things that interact with each other. That is, they influence other bodies and themselves experience the influence of other bodies. This is related to their hardness, which is understood as the inherent potential of resistance. For example, when you hit one billiard ball with another, they react and move through their hardness. If they were not hard, they would simply rub against each other without any effect. Similarly, since thoughts and emotions can influence other things or be influenced by other things, they are considered bodies. Instead of creating another metaphysical plane for non-material entities, the Stoics put all this in the same physical universe. After all, both ideas and feelings and artifacts, and your emotional reaction are bodies, billiard balls that crash into each other. Stoicism is not a religion. The stools do not worship the logos because of fear or spiritual discoveries, but try to reach the world with their own mind and live according to it. The Epictetus compares God with our eyes. We do not ask them to show us what we want to see. On the contrary, we are pleased that we have a vision and see things as they really are. Why do we pray to God to have mercy on us? So that He gives us a desire instead of what He gives. Is there anything better than what God has established? If we look at specific examples, you may not believe in gravity, but you will still crack if you fall from a height. The same goes for the logos. Our world consists of innumerable laws, and they can also be traced in social and personal life. So their ignorance leads to negative consequences. As in the case of a fall, often the stools remember the logo as God. In particular, the Epictetus and Mark Aurelius did so, but at the same time, they remembered the gods. For example, Mark Aurelius thanked the gods for their prayers, and also recognized their will as the creation of the higher for man. The ethics of the stool is also closely related to their awareness of the universe, since everything moves and is motivated by one primary reason. Everything and everyone is inseparably connected to each other. That is why the stools did not cling to public and social life, but wanted to cooperate and take as much part in it as possible. In addition, there cannot be a mistake in an ideally organized and rational universe. It is impossible that something went wrong in the absolute sense. So why worry? Stoicism in the matter of world construction is quite a thing. This philosophy suits both atheists, because the logos are the law according to which the world functions, and believers, because the stools call the logos God and do not respect the gods. The Epictetus gives the example of Socrates, who played the ball and compares it with life. Socrates was like the one who plays the ball. So what was the ball with which he played? Life, imprisonment, expulsion, employment, deprivation of a wife, abandonment of children with orphans. These were the things with which he played. But nevertheless, he continued to play and threw the ball with equality. So we have to play the game, so to speak, with maximum care and skill, but to treat the ball itself as an indifferent thing. The ball in this analogy only symbolizes the external circumstances of life, and its external appearance does not matter. Health, wealth, diseases, loss, or even death. All this can be symbolized by the ball. Before the Epictetus, he believed that there were two types of balls: unwanted things that are annoying in the absolute moral sense, but have relatively negative value, and are naturally unwanted as a disease. And the second type are desired things, which are also indifferent in the absolute moral sense, but have a relatively positive value, and are naturally desired as health. Stands divide things into three categories: good, that is, moral qualities that correspond to nature, and reason, which are included in the four values, which we will talk about later; evil, which is the opposite of the first, and has amoral actions, recklessness, cowardice, and so on; and bad things, which are neither good nor evil. When the Epictetus looks at two types of balls, he gives a relative value to bad things, and divides them into two types: mostly desired things that naturally bring comfort and satisfaction, and mostly unwanted things that bring discomfort. Instead, Socrates was able to calmly play the ball in the most difficult life situations. After an unjust sentence to death, he accepts the punishment, showing how important it is to play with honesty and peace, without allowing the external circumstances to affect our inner wholeness. The ball really doesn't matter. All that matters is how you play. The goal of the game is simple: to play as best as you can, and to develop honesty. What are you capable of, even if the game does not go according to your scenario? And obstacles in this case are a chance to show resilience and inventiveness, which is reflected in the concept of Mark Aurelius. An obstacle becomes a path. In difficult situations, a stand must show imagination and transform obstacles into opportunities. What stands in our way can become a way to overcome it, if we use the situation wisely. The example of Socrates is a bright lesson for a stand. Life is a game in which not the ball itself is important, that is, external circumstances, but how we can play with it. Socrates showed that even in the most difficult and most irreversible situations, such as death, you can remain true to your principles, controlling only your reaction to events, and not allowing external circumstances to change our moral principles. Discipline, action, four bonds. Concept of justice. There are four bonds: justice, wisdom, courage, moderation. They are the basis both in classical philosophy and in Stoicism. There are many different interpretations of these bonds and ideas about what is most important. The Stoic system of bonds is based on the teachings of Socrates and Plato, and for Socrates, wisdom is the main bond, since it is the only useful one in all situations. Wisdom helps correctly assess circumstances and make decisions that lead to a good life. On the other hand, the Stoics believe that all bonds are connected and cannot exist separately. For example, it is impossible to be brave, but at the same time not to possess moderation, because all bonds are manifestations of wisdom. In short, let's go over what bonds are. Wisdom, knowledge of what is evil, what is good, and what is bad. In practice, wisdom is the ability to see things as they are and, as a result, the ability to make the right decisions in difficult situations. Courageousness or courageousness, knowledge of what is evil and what is not evil, what is worth and what is not worth avoiding. Courage is the overcoming of difficulties. It is the ability to act properly despite fear and anxiety. Moderation, knowledge of what is worth and what is not worth being afraid of. In practice, this is the ability to act, avoiding the influence of stress, and the ability to control desires and emotions. Justice, giving to everyone and everything. It is not only about giving to people, gods, and the whole world, but also about principles, imaginations, spiritual feelings, and direction. It is believed that justice is the central value to which we strive and achieve what is impossible without the support of other values. Justice, like nothing else, manifests the direction of ethical standing. Coexistence in society requires a person to have just deeds and relations with others. To act justly, you need to understand what is justice, the knowledge that only a wise person possesses. To fight injustice, you need to have courage and self-determination. But since it is impossible to achieve complete justice, moderation allows you to remain stable and avoid extremes in your desire. To put it simply, justice requires wisdom for understanding, courage for action, and moderation for persistence. And the values themselves are a guide for a modern person who wants to live with dignity and harmony. The importance of examples. Example for others. As already stated at the beginning, Stoicism is about practical ideas, so the examples of prominent people are important for stand-ups and play a key role in the development of their moral character. As Seneca says, the truth is for all, which means that honesty is universal for all people, regardless of circumstances, and role models help to see them in action. Stand-up emphasizes the universality of truth and the value of the model of behavior for moral improvement. However, it is worth following not a person as a whole, but the best features of their character and actions. This approach allows you to avoid idealization, leaving room for critical thinking. Stand-ups take only those features and examples that are considered correct from a personal point of view. These are Socrates and Heraclius, although the latter is definitely not called a stand-up. We have already mentioned Socrates. As for Heraclius, he is a symbol of fighting evil and indomitable courage. Despite the fact that he was obviously not a stand-up, his image inspired philosophers to resist life's difficulties. In the context of modernity, there are also examples. Vice Admiral of the U.S. Navy James Stockdale became a symbol of standing self-control during his captivity in Vietnam in 1965 to 1973. Stockdale chose courage and wisdom instead of wisdom. In captivity, he realized that he could not control the torture or conditions in which he was, but his reaction and internal stability in his power. The Vice Admiral also took on moral responsibility, organizing resistance among other prisoners, and establishing a code of conduct to help them endure suffering. Courage, moderation, and wisdom became reliable guides in such a difficult situation. Stockdale mentioned that he referred to the philosophy of Epictetus, in particular to his follower Enchiridion, to preserve the moral spirit and stand in trials. I knew that the most important thing is to keep control over your soul. The body can break, but not the spirit. Pakistani activist Malala Yousafzai is a modern symbol of justice and courage. At the age of 15, Malala decided to publicly speak out against the terror and the ban on education for girls, led by the Taliban in her hometown. Even despite the attempt on her life in 2012, she did not give up her goal. Malala continues to fight for justice, not only for herself, but also for millions of girls around the world. Moreover, she remains modest and focused on her mission. Her example clearly shows the honesty of Stoicism, the courage to stand up to the threat, justice as a higher value, as well as moderation and wisdom, which helps to remain devoted to your ideals, even in the most difficult conditions. In fact, there is no need to go far for examples. Today in Ukrainian society, we have enough of them. Ukrainian soldiers who fell into Russian captivity during the war demonstrate extraordinary resilience, courage, and dedication to their principles, which are vivid examples of honesty that need to be inherited. Discipline of consent contrary to their concept of impressions. Epictetus taught that the discipline of consent is a skill that is applied to our impressions in order to interpret and assess the world and external situations. We must act in such a way as to avoid the traps of subjective impressions, to be free from deception and false judgments regarding how to act in the first two disciplines. Death and suicide in the stands. Death for the stands is a motivator for life, because death is an irreversible natural process, and therefore it makes no sense to be afraid. Epictetus, as an argument for the stupidity of this fear, gives the example of a drunk Kolos. If Kolos had a feeling, should he pray that he would never be burned? But it would be a curse for a wheat, to desire not to be seen and not to be gathered. A prayer for someone not to die is equal to a curse, and is similar to a prayer for not to be seen and not to be gathered. People, like creatures, are meant for the dead, and although we are aware of this fact, we often get angry because of it, because we do not know who we are, and we do not study human nature in the same way as those who ride horses study the nature and the purpose of horses. A person must die or give his place to a new life. Epictetus calmly responded to this chain, as well as to the banquet or the Olympic Games, where there is a beginning and an end. It is necessary to get rid of the fear of death, in particular by changing your worldview. By dichotomy control, the limitation of existence urges us to act, because if a person could do anything and any time, then doing something would not make sense, because there is eternity ahead. Epictetus sees the fear of death as the main evil in this matter, and urges us to fight it, adding all our efforts to it. We will become dust and will not escape it, and if we succeed, it will be a curse. The embodiment of such a thought can be seen in Sisyphus, Prometheus, and other characters with a similar doctrine. The other side of the question of death is suicide. A small disclaimer: please refer to the following information with caution and awareness. The exit from the window is never really an exit and a decision, and in a state of strong repression, it is better to turn to a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist for professional help. History knows many examples of how the adherents of Stoicism voluntarily broke their lives. For example, the very founder of the Stoicism school, Zenon Kiktievsky, died because he was old and did not see the benefits for society. Stoics compared suicide with open doors, in which you can always enter, just as death motivates us to act. The existence of open doors, according to philosophers, gives the courage to endure the most difficult trials, because, as they say, there is always a way out, and a person can choose when to go. However, for such a radical action, wisdom is necessary, that is, understanding that these open doors are the only way out of the situation, in order to preserve dignity and gain peace. Therefore, if a person gets rid of life through a trifle, Stoics definitely do not approve of such an action. As the Epictetus says, stay, do not act, do not entertain. It is not in my power to control how a person can understand and study Stoics, but I do not recommend looking for approval of one's own actions and their justification in philosophy. Suicide is a serious problem, and it should not be ignored. Stoic practices, as I said before. Stoicism is a philosophy of action and discipline. So Stoics have a lot of spiritual practices to daily check yourself and live decently. When I say a lot, there are really a lot of them. Each of the words of a Stoic can be thought over and taken to arms, not counting how many Stoics there were. In addition, Stoicism does not have a clear doctrine, and therefore you have to independently study the work and find something for yourself. However, I will list some of these practices. Study your impressions, so do not learn to say to everyone a strong impression that you are just an impression and not its cause. Then check and evaluate it according to your criteria. But first ask yourself, is this something that is in my power or not? And if this is not what you can control, be ready to say, this is not my problem. Epictetus proposes to use control dichotomy to analyze one's own emotions and experiences, our initial reactions to certain events. To do this, you need to abstain from hasty conclusions. Thoughts, become aware of the situation, and give yourself space for thoughts to determine whether you can really solve this problem. If the situation cannot really be solved, you do not need to worry about it. Remember the past of things. What about specific things that bring you joy, happiness, benefits, or to which you are attached? Recall what they are. Start with things of small value. If you like a clay jar, tell yourself, I like a jar. When it breaks, you will not be so embarrassed. When you kiss your wife or child, repeat to yourself, I kiss the mortal. Then you will not be so embarrassed if they are taken away from you. In this excerpt, the Epictetus advises to look at the essence of things. And if the quote was limited to only examples with a jar, it would be a good call against modern consumption. However, the philosopher does not limit himself to this example. At first glance, he refers to the unity, attachment to things and love for loved ones, which is not quite so. The Epictetus emphasizes the fragility of things and people. Just as a dish can suddenly break, so a loved one can suddenly die. And so, keeping this in mind, we should value every moment we spend with our loved ones. This, of course, will not get you rid of sadness, but will get you rid of regret for lost opportunities and words. The rule of observation. Every time you plan an action, you imagine what it envisions. If you are going to a bathhouse, imagine a typical bathhouse scenario. People splash with water, push, scream, and can steal your clothes. You will finish this case with more peace. If you tell yourself at the beginning, I want to wash, but at the same time, I want to preserve my freedom in harmony with nature. Do the same with every action. Thus, if something spoils your bath, you will be ready to think, well, that was not my only goal. I also had an intention to preserve my freedom in harmony with nature, which is impossible if I lose my self-control when something bad happens. Usually, we tend not to consider unwanted scenarios as development of our own plans. And so, when everything goes wrong, we start to get angry. In the example with the bathhouse, the Epictetus warns us from such mistakes of thinking. And even if an unwanted scenario happens, we should remember that in addition to your plans, there is another goal: to remain a whole, faithful to your principles person, and to refrain from wrong actions. This does not mean that it is worth tolerating someone else's rudeness, but to foresee it and to solve it within the framework of your principles. How can I apply honesty here and now? Remember, for every call, it is worth looking for strength in yourself to fight it. If you are tempted by the look of a handsome man or woman, you will discover strength in yourself of self-control. When you meet God, you will find strength in perseverance. If you are offended, you will discover patience. Over time, you will be sure that there is no impression or situation with which you will not have moral means to fight. According to the philosophy of the pillars, every obstacle and call is an opportunity to work on yourself and become better. And in this excerpt, the Epictetus tells how different temptations and disagreements can make a person better. In this way, overcoming these obstacles, you learn to control yourself and gain character to resist further attempts. The pillars called such a state refers to something like apathy, but not in the modern sense of the word. In the understanding of the pillars, this word meant peace of mind, ready for any life situation. Do not postpone the fight, act now. The next time you come across something unpleasant or difficult, glorious or shameful, remember that the time has come to fight. Your Olympic fight has come, and you will no longer be able to postpone it. One action and one day determines whether you will save the progress you have made or lose it. The Olympic Games of life have already begun, and even if you did not take part before, it is time to join now, not tomorrow, because then the tests will be much more difficult. Speak little and in essence. Let silence be your goal. Speak only what is necessary and do it briefly. In rare cases, when you are asked to speak, then speak, but not about banalities in the form of gladiators, horses, sports, food, or drinks. Most importantly, do not gossip about people. Do not praise, do not blame, and do not compare them. At the same time, the Epictetus Council should speak about themselves, as they are unlikely to need. It is difficult to add something here. In fact, there are times when it is better to keep your mouth shut. So let's move on to the next tips. Choose the right friends. Avoid close communication with people who do not share a philosophical view of life. But if necessary, be careful so as not to fall to their level. After all, as you know, if your companion is dirty, his friends will also get a little dirty, no matter how clean they were at the beginning. Under people who share a philosophical view, Epictetus did not mean these weirdos who have wasted their lives, but people who want to become better in their own honesty and character, and thus improve their own and social status. However, this does not mean that you should throw away friends who do not strive for self-improvement. I will add that friendship with a person who knows what is best for you and wants more also motivates you to get up on this path and go shoulder to shoulder. And it works both ways. So it is not worth taking this advice so categorically. Each friend needs his own approach. Respond to images with humor. If you find out that someone speaks ill of you, do not try to defend yourself against the reader, but answer, yes, and he does not even know half, because he could say more. This is a great example of wisdom supplemented by your own special humor of Epictetus. Instead of being offended by images that are out of our control, respond with self-irony. You will feel better, and your image will be disheveled or at least disarmed. Speak without judgment. Someone washes in a hurry. Do not say that he washes badly, but in a hurry. Someone drinks a lot of wine. Don't say that they do it badly, but that they drink a lot, until you find out their reasons. How can you know that their actions are bad? This will save you from clearly perceiving one thing and then agreeing with something else. This is a fairly common problem that you can face from both sides, as a person with a problem and as a person who makes an excessive comment. For example, there are situations when your friend behaves more toxic and aggressively for no apparent reason. But is this due to his attitude towards people like garbage? Most likely not, and you should find out the real reason and help if possible. But this advice is not universal, because in life, you can meet people with both non-obvious problems and simply evil in their intentions. Reflect on each day you live. Don't let sleep enter your eyelids until you summarize each action of the day. How I made a mistake, what I did or left undone. Start like this and review your actions, and then reproach yourself for bad actions, and rejoice for good ones. Such advice can be found not only in Epictetus, but also in Stoic and Marcus Aurelius. We need to check ourselves every day, analyze our own actions, and become better. Subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, mental toughness, and life-changing mindset shifts.